Imagine you grow up in a small fishing town. On a lake everyone in Galilee knows by name. You know every face that leaves town on the North Road. The fisherman with his nets still wet, the merchant with 3 donkeys of grain, the rabbi's son on his way to Jerusalem. You've eaten at some of their tables. You've buried some of their parents. Now imagine your job, every single day, is to stand at a booth on that same road and stop every one of them. Not strangers. Not soldiers from some foreign province. Them. You weigh what they're carrying. Take a cut for a foreign king and keep whatever you can justify keeping for yourself. You didn't leave your town to betray it. You never left at all. The betrayal came right to your own front step, and it wore your own face. That is not a metaphor. That is the documented job of the man history knows as Matthew, long before he was an apostle, long before he wrote a gospel that Christians would read for 2,000 years. He worked a customs post inside his own hometown of Capernaum. And what that job actually meant to the people who watched him do it is almost nothing like what a modern viewer assumes when they hear tax collector. We assume annoyance, like a man in a beige office building. The evidence points somewhere much closer to treason. Stay to the end, because the deepest layer of this story isn't about money at all. It's a legal fact about Matthew's own status that almost no sermon ever mentions. And it's the reason Jesus choosing him wasn't just kind. It was scandalous. Rome did not send its own soldiers to stand at every crossroads in Judea and count coins. That would have cost more than the taxes were worth. Instead, the right to collect tolls, market fees, and road duties was auctioned off sold, region by region, to men willing to guarantee a fixed sum to the treasury. Whatever that contractor collected above the guaranteed amount, he kept, under Herod Antipas, Galilee's tetrarch and Rome's client. This system reached all the way down to small border posts like the one in Capernaum. Matthew's booth existed because 2 rulers' territories happened to touch at that exact spot on the road. Let's start with the reason everyone already assumes, because it's real. It's just not the whole story. The loudest reason: the money. When crowds of tax collectors came out to a preacher named John, camped by the Jordan asking what they should do to set their lives right, his answer wasn't quit. It was collect no more than what you are authorized to collect. Sit with what that instruction assumes. He didn't have to explain what the abuse was. Everyone in earshot already knew the shape of it. The default expectation, spoken to their faces, at the moment of their own repentance, was that they were currently taking more than they should. That's the layer every modern reader gets on their own. Overcharging was real, common enough to need its own sermon. And it's the reason the word still carries a sting today. But if greed were the whole answer, a scrupulously honest tax collector should have been welcomed back into normal society the moment he stopped skimming. He wasn't. Which means something heavier than money was actually running underneath. The reason that's harder to hear: he had no legal voice. In Jewish courts of the period, tax collectors were grouped in the same disqualified category as robbers. Their earnings were treated legally as though they were stolen property. And that classification carried a devastating practical consequence: they could not serve as witnesses. Picture what that means concretely. If a thief broke into Matthew's own house that night, and Matthew stood up in a Jewish court to say who did it, the law would not let his word count. Not because his neighbors merely disliked him, because on paper, before he had personally taken a single unjust coin, the system had already decided his testimony was worthless. Imagine living inside that verdict every day, long before you'd done anything yourself to earn it. That's the quiet cost nobody warns you about: being prejudged, permanently, for a job you may be doing honestly. And it gets quieter still. The reason most modern readers miss completely: he couldn't share a meal. Continuous contact with foreign coinage, foreign goods, and a foreign ruler's administration made a tax collector's presence a source of ritual concern under Pharisaic purity practice. So the Gospels don't describe him as merely disliked. They pair him, again and again, with sinners as a fixed social category, the excluded. And in that culture, a shared table wasn't background scenery. It was the clearest public signal of who belonged to whom. Sitting down to eat with someone meant absorbing their status into your own, in full view of the town. Which means every single meal Matthew's family or old friends might once have shared with him was a small, constant, public risk they eventually stopped taking. The exclusion didn't arrive as a single dramatic scene. It arrived one skipped dinner at a time. That's easy to miss because it leaves no single verse to point at. It shows up instead in the empty space around every meal scene involving him, which is exactly the space Jesus is about to walk directly into. The reason that sounds reasonable and is wrong, that it was only ever about the tax burden. This is the popular version, and it isn't false so much as it's shallow. Most people read the hostility toward tax collectors the way they'd read hostility toward a modern collections agency, an understandable irritation about money changing hands. It misses something the evidence keeps insisting on. John's crowd wasn't told to stop being tax collectors. They were told to be honest ones, which means the deeper offense wasn't the office itself demanding correction, it was what the office represented, regardless of how it was run. A Jewish man, standing at the seam of his own community, working machinery built by the empire that ruled his people. You could fix the overcharging. You could not fix which side of the seam you were standing on. And that seam is exactly where the last and most important layer sits. The reason that explains everything else, where the booth actually was. Capernaum sat precisely on the border between Herod Antipas's Galilee and the neighboring territory ruled by his brother, Herod Philip, a Jewish tetrarchy pressed up against a mostly Gentile one. Matthew's post wasn't stationed at some distant imperial frontier he'd been sent to guard. It sat inside his own town, on a road his own family had probably walked their whole lives, marking the exact line where one Jewish ruler's authority stopped and another's began. His betrayal, if that's the word for it, was never abstract or far away. It was hyperlocal. He was collecting tolls from people he'd grown up next to, on behalf of a Jewish king who was himself answering to Rome. Now put all 5 of those layers back together and look at who Jesus actually walked up to. Not a stranger from a hated foreign class, a neighbor disqualified from testifying in his own defense, cut off from his own town's tables, standing at the exact seam of 2 worlds, and Jesus said, simply, "Follow me." The man the court wouldn't let speak became one of the 4 men whose written testimony about Jesus has been read for 2,000 years. The most legally silenced witness in Capernaum became one of history's most read witnesses. That reversal is the whole point, and it's easy to read past it if you don't know what tax collector actually cost a man to be. Matthew wasn't the only one. Further south, in Jericho, a man named Zacchaeus held a bigger version of the same job, not just a collector, but an archaeological, an overseer managing other collectors beneath him. In a city whose wealth came largely from its famous balsam groves, local tradition still points to a stone tower in the area and calls it the House of Zacchaeus, though that identification rests on tradition rather than confirmed excavation, so it's worth holding loosely. What is firmly established is the title Luke gives him, the scale of Jericho's tax economy, and the fact that Zacchaeus climbed a tree not because he was short, but because a man in his position had no natural claim to space in that crowd. Nobody was going to make room for him. He had to go over their heads to see anything at all. And Jesus stopped, looked up, and invited himself to that man's table anyway. So here's the whole shape of it, compressed. The loud reason is money real, but not the root. The harder reason is a legal silence placed on him before he did anything wrong. The quiet reason is a lifetime of skipped meals. The reasonable-sounding reason collapses once you notice the correction demanded was conduct, not identity. And the reason underneath all of it is geography. A man standing on the exact line his own people were most afraid of, collecting for the side that had conquered them. If you've ever been the person whose word didn't count in a room, written off before you opened your mouth, sorted into a category before anyone checked the facts, this is worth sitting with for a moment. The story doesn't say Jesus overlooked what Matthew was. It says he walked straight up to the one detail everyone else used to disqualify him, and used it as the reason to call him closer. Not despite the seam Matthew stood on. Because of it, somebody was always going to be needed at that exact spot, between 2 worlds, able to describe both of them honestly, and history handed that job, in the end, not to the men who'd never been questioned, but to the one man everyone had already agreed couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. You now know what that title actually cost. The money he could no longer justify keeping, the voice a court refused to hear, the table he stopped being invited to, the ground he stood on that belonged to no one cleanly. Read Matthew 9 again with that in your ears, and the 4 words "he rose and followed him" will not sound small anymore.